Hello, and thank you very much for joining us for the webinar today. My name is Judith Krause. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Politics and the Interdisciplinary Global Development Centre at the University of York in the UK. This webinar is being hosted by the Interdisciplinary Global Development Centre together with the Independent Social Research Foundation. The Interdisciplinary Global Development Centre, also known as IGDC, is a learning and research community working for equitable global development based at the University of York. IGDC undertakes interdisciplinary research focusing on social justice, global health, and sustainable environments. We also offer undergraduate and postgraduate academic programs in global development. The Centre brings together researchers from across the humanities, the social and natural sciences within the University of York and globally. We encourage researchers to work with diverse stakeholders such as policymakers, practitioners, and communities to address real-world global development challenges. Today's webinar on rethinking recovery in Latin American landscapes, knowledges, conservation, and justice, organized by Dr. Hannah Cotton and myself, is part of the IGDC's current webinar series, placing a particular focus on recovery and how communities worldwide have been affected by climate change, COVID-19, and other intersecting crises. Our webinar brings together three wonderful South American speakers, whom Hannah Cotton will introduce in a minute, to think through how these intersecting planetary crises are affecting landscapes, such as woodlands, wetlands, and grasslands, and the people who live in them. Amid notions of degradation and conservation, we are asking how local communities, public institutions, and other actors understand and implement recovery, and how these initiatives engage with diverse knowledges, including indigenous and peasant knowledges. What is being recovered and by whom? And what can policy and research around landscape recovery teach us about environmental justice? In today's panel, our speakers' expertise from diverse landscapes and communities in South America will help us rethink recovery in nature conservation through a critical and interdisciplinary lens. I will now hand over to Despina Livioratou from the Independent Social Research Foundation for a brief introduction to ISRF.
Hi everyone, my name is Despina Livioratou and I'm the academic assistant at the Independent Social Research Foundation. I would like to start by saying thank you all for organizing this amazing workshop, which bringing us together here today. With special thanks to Han for obvious reasons, she's one of our fellows, and many thanks for also having me here and be given a chance to talk briefly about ISRF as an entity. So one of the key aspects of my role within the foundation is to be the first point of contact for all the academic inquiries, and as such, do not hesitate to contact me on my email, which will appear shortly in the chat box. So without further ado, I will briefly get you through the institution. So ISRF, as it stands, is the Independent Social Research Foundation, funded in 2008 and is dedicated to the promotion of unorthodox social research. There are multiple ways through which ISRF wishes to support the research within the social sciences, and in order to achieve our mission, we offer a number of academic activities within the social sciences. Our main contribution to this is to offer a series of competitions as funding opportunities, and we've been running quite a few competitions varying from early career, mid-career, but also small groups grants. You can see the competitions that we currently run in more detail here on the link, but also by clicking the one in the chat box, where you will find all the relevant information about that. We also issue our bulletin on a frequent basis, which is edited by our academic editor. Our bulletin touches on various topical themes and gives the way for our fellows, but also for other colleagues to have their say on several topics. Our latest one was on disability studies, but you can find again our archive, which includes many topics, again by clicking on the link which must have been sent to the chat box as well. ISRF also holds a partnership with the Conversation website, where fellows and other academics often are offered to write an article, which will be published in the interdisciplinary section of the site that we have with them there. And therefore, you can also find a range of topics from ISRF fellows and other colleagues on the link, again, in the chat box. I would also like to inform you that we organize book launches events, which are both in person and online, and are all are welcome to attend for free. Our upcoming one is Inventing Value, authored by our former fellow Dave Eldervas, and is taking place on like the very next week. Obviously, you can find all the details on our website too. But I would also highly recommend subscribing to our newsletter so as to be informed as soon as an event had just been announced and generated. And you can also see our other academic events in the same link. And finally, let me end by mentioning that in the context of social research promotion, we also provide a platform where conversation and discussions around the theme by organizing annual conferences. So each conference will be themed around the topic, methodology, or debate of interest within and across the social sciences and humanities. Our latest conference, which took place in Athens, in Greece, was on the digital condition and humanities knowledge, where all were welcome to attend by presenting their paper in relevant to the conference topic. And based on this, I would love to invite you all to consider expressing your interest in our next conference, which will be held in Bologna, Italy, next autumn 2023. So the theme for that, as you can see on the slide, is built around climate crisis, global capitalism, and higher education. And therefore, we invite proposal for conference papers on the relations among climate, capitalism, and education as well. So at this stage, I want to say that you're all strongly advised to indicate your interest by emailing me. So the deadline is on the 21st of January at the email provided again on the chat box. I think that's all, and hand over to you.
Great, thank you, Despina. My name is Hannah Kotin. I'm a research associate at the Department of History and at the IGDC at the University of York, and I'm indeed a fellow with the ISRF. And before I introduce you all to our panel of today, I would like to mention a few housekeeping rules. This session is being recorded, but only the video and audio of the panelists is recorded, and the attendees' microphones are muted. Your video is off and won't be recorded. The only information that may be recorded are any questions that you might type in that may include your name, which could be identifiable on your Zoom name. The recording will be available on the IGDC YouTube channel, and it will become available in, usually takes a couple of days, so in the next few days, you can find the recording of the webinar today on YouTube, on the channel. If you want to ask any questions, you can use the Q&A button that you find at the bottom bar. Panelists will be answering the questions that you submit through that function. Questions can be voted on, so if you see that someone has already asked your question in the Q&A box, or any question that you think is particularly interesting, you can give it a vote, and those questions with the most votes will be answered first. Those of you who are on Twitter, you can find and follow us at York IGDC and at the Twitter link also of ISRF in the chat box. And you can also use the hashtag IGDC webinar to talk about this webinar on Twitter. If you have any technical issues, please do use the chat function to talk to the IGDC webinar host. So that means that the Q&A box on the bottom is used for your questions for the panel, but tech issues will be dealt with through the chat function. Now I would like to introduce and welcome our panel of the webinar of today. First, we have Dr. Laila Sandroni. Laila is an anthropologist and geographer with experience in transdisciplinary research in social sciences. Her research interests lie in the role of different kinds of knowledge in defining the best path to achieve biodiversity conservation and forest management. She has particular expertise in epistemology, power knowledge relations, and evidence-based policy on environmental issues. We'll then have Dr. Santiago Martinez Medina. Santiago is an anthropologist working at the interface of anthropology and science and technology studies, and his research interests lie in knowledge practices inside and outside science and other kinds of expertise. He's lately working on the production of nature as a result of practices, including practices in biology and other natural sciences, and looking at the capacity of these practices and this production of nature to make a univocal world, a world that is singular. And our third speaker is Professor Manuel Prieto Montt. Manuel is geographer and professor at the Universidad de Tarapacá, Arica, research associate at the Center of Intercultural and Indigenous Research in Chile, and he's also director of the newly established research center, Millennium Nucleus in Andean peatlands. His research agenda is situated at the intersection of cultural and political ecology, political geography, and environmental science. In his current project, he's focusing on understanding the socio-ecological transformations of the high Andean wetlands and the agricultural valleys of the Atacama Desert in relation to climate change, the privatization of nature, the cultural management of water, changes in land use, and industrial activities. Now, a few words about the format. We will first invite each of our speakers to introduce us to the landscapes that they work in and with, and present their work in light of the questions that were introduced by Dr. Judith Kraus on what is being recovered in these landscapes and who is involved in that process. We will then go over for Q&A. So as soon as questions come, just do use the Q&A box to start sharing your questions. And we will finish with a takeaway message with some final reflections by going back to our invited speakers to close the webinar of today. But first of all, I now want to pass the word to Laila.
Thank you so much, Hein. So first of all, I'd like to thank Hein, Judith, Lydia, and Despoina for the invitation and for putting together such an interesting concept note for this event and making us come together to think about this really important question about what is being recovered and how. So just to add a little bit to my presentation before I pass on to the actual landscapes, I just wanted to offer some caveats on my positionality while speaking about the indigenous peoples in the Brazilian Northeast. So I have started working with indigenous peoples in that region of Brazil about 10 years ago. First, as an activist, we have developed with them processes of participatory mapping in 2 specific indigenous communities in the state of Bahia that led to the production of 2 web documentaries about their life and their struggle. Then after that, I have engaged in a process of installing the points of culture, which was a policy made by the Brazilian Ministry for Culture that mainly had the goal of recognizing indigenous cultural aspects and enhancing them. So at that point, I have participated in the implementation of this policy in 8 different indigenous communities in the Northeast. By the time the second project ended, I have started my PhD, and I was thinking about working with conservation NGOs. I had a completely different project in mind. But due to those previous relations to the indigenous communities, one specific indigenous leader, Cacique Jamupoti Tupinambá, took me by the arm and said, "You're doing your PhD here." Basically, that's what she said to me. And I have worked with them to think about their perspective on conservation and how they are developing areas of recovery in the Tupinambá indigenous land in southern Bahia. So I'll just start sharing my screen to provide a little bit of context. So I have entitled my contribution for today's webinar, Retake and Recover Indigenous Forest Management in the Brazilian Northeast. So first, just to understand the context of the indigenous populations of the northeast of Brazil, we're talking about this area here, which is the area of Brazil, the coastal line that's closer to Europe. So the process of colonization in Brazil started from this area. So the process of installation of successive cycles of plantations in the northeastern region of Brazil started already around the 1500s and went on until today. So we are talking about indigenous populations that have this long history of contact and colonization. We're not talking about the indigenous isolated ethnicities that still exist in the Amazonian region, for instance. So these people were declared by the Brazilian state after the proclamation of the Republic in the 1900s as extinct. So that meant that they didn't have any rights as indigenous populations for cultural difference, access to land, nor possibilities for being recognized by the state and by the Brazilian society as indigenous populations. They were denied this right in the beginning of the last century, and this process was a part of the continuity of the colonial process of erasing their history as indigenous populations to make them Brazilians, so to speak. So this is something that was really strong, especially in this area where the indigenous populations had a long history of contact. Nonetheless, especially over the last 30 years, indigenous movements scaled up throughout the whole region. So if the Brazilian census from the 1980s recognized that there were about 10,000 people that identified themselves as indigenous in the Brazilian Northeast, the census of 2010 recognized at least 550,000 people recognizing themselves as indigenous. So you can get the size of this process. This movement started in the 1980s mainly, but they increased a lot since the 2000s because during the year of 2000, the Brazilian government started the celebrations of the 500 years of Brazil. And at this point, many of the indigenous population that were starting to organize themselves gathered in the place that, according to the myth of the Brazilian discovery, to say that this was not a discovery, this was an invasion, and that they were the indigenous populations that were here when the Portuguese arrived. So in 2000, this gathering of the indigenous leaders in the celebration of the Brazilian discovery was really important to organize the movement and make it grow. So the main tactic that is used by this really diverse movement of different ethnicities of indigenous populations are called the retomadas. The retomadas in Portuguese means something really close to what we could say in English as retake. And the idea is that they are getting back to them all the things that they believe were usurped from them during the process of colonization throughout those 500 years. So that means the material aspects and also symbolic aspects. So they are taking back their land and also taking back their history. So it's a concomitant process of rewriting counter narratives that are most common in Brazil, to say that the indigenous populations are only in the Amazon, that there are no indigenous peoples anymore in the Northeast, and also recognizing their own history of subjugation and how their history of resistance was erased to give place to this so-called acculturation paradigm. So they, as if they got their culture lost. And in this process, they started also to reach out to different spiritual leaders of the indigenous populations of the Northeast to recognize ways of getting back also to their old ancestral rituals and cultural practices. So they fight against a symbolic prejudice and at the same time for environmental justice. So one of the parts of the retomadas, the retakes, is also effectively occupying the territory they understand as part of their own ethnicity. So this is one of the phrases they use to recognize that miscegenation did not lead to a homogenization. So they say a lot this phrase to address the fact that they use clothes, they watch TV, they eat junk food, but they are indigenous anyhow. So I can be who you are without ceasing to be who I am. So we are talking about the 90s and the 2000s. There was this big escalation for indigenous rights in the Northeast, a movement growing in several places, several conflicts regarding the occupation of lands through the retakes. And at the same time, there was a growth in public policies for a recovery, forest recovery, over those same areas. So the mainstream recovery policies addressed these processes through two specific concepts that are spread throughout the globe. The concept of corridor and the concept of prioritization of specific areas due to the occurrence of threatened species. So we have a really strong network. I have highlighted here some of the institutions that were a part of this process in Brazil at that period, but many other institutions were there as well, and really highly connected to global environmental movements. And the main policies that were done to recover were recognize the priority areas for forest conservation models, therefore parks and biological reserves, and make recovery process between them, the linkages between the core protected areas. So I'll try very briefly to recognize how this, I recognize that I'm a little bit short on time here, so I'll just give one example. For instance, the Pataxó people in southern Bahia, they had their original lands taken by a park. So they recognize this process as also the continuation of coloniality, and they try to counter that narrative with the articulation of an indigenous Monte Pascoal, which is the name of the park there. So I'll jump on to how they are viewing recovery, because this was a second example of how mainstream recovery and forest conservation is made. I can get back to that if we have time. So to counter that with an example of indigenous recovery from a local perspective, the Cariri Chocó from Sergipe, they have taken back their land, and they have managed to make all of it that was a rice plantation to forest again, so they could make this space here so they could perform their old ritual, the Oricuri. So this is the recovery that they are making, and this is not connected to all state policies whatsoever. No policies support this type of recovery, but they took an area that was 15,000 acre long and made it a forest again, so they could perform their ritual as they understand that their ancestors did. So I'm going to stop here because I understand that I'm out of time, but I can share some other examples and insights afterwards. Thank you.
Wonderful. That was really great, Laila. And yeah, I'm sure that we can get into more examples and more insights also through the Q&A. But that was really fascinating. Thank you. I'll now pass the word to Santiago.
Thank you very much, Han, and thank you all for the invitation. So I'm going to share my screen. And also to read some words that I prepared for this webinar. In the last couple of years, we have been working with Páramo. For us, it is very important to stress that we find it difficult to say we work in Páramo, meaning working in an ecosystem, and for it using the usual definition of Páramo as a particular geographical and ecological entity. For most Colombians, Páramo can be defined as a high tropical Andean ecosystem. This is the definition that natural science and policy have been developing in the last 50 years. To say Páramo in current Colombian parlance is also to refer to a strategic ecosystem because it produces water, houses a rich biodiversity, and storage carbon as a natural sink. The conservation of the Páramo has become a national quest, one with the capacity to articulate science and policy in the shape of existence of an extensive legislation capable of restricting severely mining and agricultural activities. This causes huge impacts on campesino ways of life. Indeed, to say Páramo in Colombia is also to refer to all these complexities, even if they are partially hidden beneath a definition that seems neutral and because it's scientificity. An important caveat: even if the scientists say that Páramo is a sociological landscape, the way of doing Páramo through natural science finds difficult to find a place in Páramo to people. For that reason, the practices of inhabiting Páramo always look as degradation of a natural ecosystem through a thought as nature. Páramo has not always been a high tropical ecosystem. In our archival work, we have faced a curious situation in front of some documents, for instance, with this picture. Looking to a picture, for instance, the picture that you are looking at in the moment and at this moment, looking to a picture of what we see today as Páramo, we cannot find an unified concept of it in our reading of the text. Sometimes we cannot find even a mention in documents related to water intake. Actually, Páramo was a synonymous of a wasteland, far, cold, unproductive, uninhabited. More an adjective than an unknown, Páramo was a topographical descriptor. For that reason, some decades ago, no one could claim to the Páramo, but everyone could claim to a specific Páramo. For instance, Páramo de Huasca, Páramo de Choachí, Páramo de Fomeke. In the picture that you are seeing, we are seeing one person on horseback, and we don't know exactly who is this man. Probably Matt Haller or Wills. We find this picture in a proposal for the aqueduct company in order to make an aqueduct in one of these areas. Walking with campesinos in their land in the Páramo de Sumapaz, we learned that Páramo could also be made as autonomy. In the Páramo, he does not need money to eat, employing it to make money or to be allowed to make a life. Obviously, his work transformed the landscape, but the same can be said of the Bogotá Aqueduct Company that evicted campesinos in the Páramo de Chingaza to protect the water that flows inside pipes to the house of millions of people in Bogotá. Today, Chingaza is protected by a natural national park and has become the best example of a natural páramo. In this history, nature is not the contrary to society. On the contrary, páramo as nature has been produced as material semiotic entity for a varied set of practices. Páramos as inhabited campesino landscape and as a natural ecosystem are two versions partially connected. Even so, the two do not have the same capacity to enroll public opinions, collaborators, and sympathizers. The two do not have the same sense of being true. In our work, we are very interested in the asymmetric relationship between divergent versions of Páramo. Campesino help us to think in Páramo as an uncommon nature, one that cannot be defined only by the means of law and science. In the case of Páramo, we think recovery also as a difficult conversation between divergent practices. The answer cannot be to displace all campesinos from Páramo in the name of a nature that is also a very human product and a very human project, as we can see in the picture. At the same time, the answer cannot be to give up the scientific practices that have transformed our understanding of the Páramo as more than a human environment, in the last decades. There are too many lives in danger. Human and not human, and not only human. Thinking from the Páramo, we propose these key points to our conversation about recovery. The first is in a form of question also. Could we think recovery beyond the linear understanding of time? The prefix re, of recovery, means that there is something to lose that needs to be recovered. Could we open our understanding of Páramo because of divergence and not to close our definition because of it? We need practice of design our lives and worlds capable of making complex versions of the past and the future. My second point is, how could we open our understanding of what needs to be conserved? Scientists have been a very important player in the delimitation of what is worthy. Do we need a conversation between practice also to define what needs to be conserved? Could we protect also campesino practice as Páramo conservation? If we are talking about recovery and conservation of landscapes, do we also have a human understanding of landscape? To have such a thing means to consider our own sense of landscape as a historical, affective, and situated way of feeling and making landscape. Spoiler alert, our own is not the only way. And finally, what kind of science we need in order to participate of recovery? How can we consider Páramo as not only a human landscape and also as a human landscape simultaneously and paradoxically? We do not have answers to these questions. We prefer to imagine an opening capable of transforming the way we make the questions. Even in times of crisis, we continue thinking our environmental problems as problems of the environment. We need to transform our habits of thought in order to learn how to recover and conserve a future that needs to be designed from a turbulent present. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Santiago. That was, and also really thank you for bringing up those questions. Actually, your questions, I want to use them also as an invitation for everybody listening, participating in this webinar, to also share your own questions. For the panelists, do use the Q&A box and share them with us so we can take them up with the panelists. Thanks again, Santiago, and I now pass the floor to Manuel.
Well, thanks for the invitation. What I would like to present, it's part of collective work that we all developed in this new Andean Peatland Study Center named AndesPeat, which we will inaugurate very soon. Here we seek to study the socio-ecological transformation of Andean high-altitude peatlands concerning climate change, extractive industries, institutional frameworks, and local management by herders. Within this broader agenda in today's presentation, I will explain how we think about recovery and its political implication, all of them in line with what my colleagues has presented before. So the images that predominate about the Atacama Desert is a lonely and death territory where life is impossible in this kind of most Mars-like environment on Earth. However, in the Atacama, we can find this counterintuitive ecosystem, bofedales, or ocos, or jucu in Aymara, or joco in Quechua. These are azonal high Andean wetlands distributed along the Andes Mountains, mainly in Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. They are located approximately between 3,200 meters and 5,000 meters above the sea level, and are dominated by cushion-forming plants that accumulate dense layers of organic matter, peat, which make them the ecosystem with the highest biomass productivity among others in the region. Despite the hyper-arid condition of the Atacama, in Chile, the existence of bofedales is not insignificant. They cover a significant part of the Chilean northern highlands, where they look like green islands, forming archipelagos of vegetation in the middle of the desert. Indeed, our team members identified more than 5,665 units of these peatlands that you can see in this map. They represent one of the most crucial water reservoirs and carbon storage ecosystem in the dry Andes, providing exceptional ecological functions and the welfare of local population. And among other socio-ecological functions, they have a high degree of biodiversity and endemism, regulate water flows to ensure the stability of the soil, thus controlling erosion. They are also a key part of the global climate system due to the high carbon sequestration capacity. Also, a vibrant cultural sites for Andean pastoral societies, such as Aymara, Quechuas, and Atacameños. And see, pre-Hispanic times, they have been used as permanent and highly nutritious source of fodder for domesticated camelids, llamas, and alpacas. Now, bofedal plants, moreover, serve medicinal and spiritual uses, while peat can also be used for fuel and fertilizer. At a first sight, bofedales appear as a purely natural, a product of the whim of nature that exists by themselves. However, they are not. Many bofedales are produced, expanded, conserved, and improved through cultural practices. Thus, they result from the combination of social agency and the non-human world. For example, what you see here is not a water stream, but a canal created by herders for distributing water across the bofedal and irrigating it. Herders have managed and even created new bofedales through different practices for thousands of years. Among other techniques, we can find irrigation, the use of infrastructure such as canals, pipes and dams, pumping and wells, fire management, fertilization, land use rotation, transplanting, and also rituals and customary governance. Therefore, bofedales are socio-hydrological ecosystems, places where peat-forming processes and society co-evolve through continuous engagement over space and time. The management of bofedales is often hidden. Herders are like invisible gardeners. Their technology is so unnoticeable that sometimes it's impossible to distinguish between what is natural and what's not. For example, these rocks or little stones that you can see here seems to be there randomly. However, herders have carefully placed them to divert and distribute the water in this peatland. Now, not all managerial techniques are traditional, as some anthropologists want to portray. Herders are not lost in time and space. On the contrary, they are in contact with modernity and use industrial technology for management, like these pipes to transport water. Now, the importance and the scale of this management invite us to seriously rethink what we understand by recovery and conservation, and specifically, what is it that we want to recover and who is involved in recovery? These images illustrate these problems very well. This is a new bofedal, the object of what we want to recover or conserve, carefully produced by herders who live there, those involved in the recovery and conservation, in a space where there was not peatlands and no herders in the recent past. Now, if the ontology of the bofedales is this kind of socio-hydrological ecosystem, then the invitation is to destabilize the linear idea of recovering nature as a process of returning to some natural state in the past, as shown previously in the other presentation. And if the goal is to sustain, improve, conserve, and expand this essential ecosystem, then there is nothing to recover. They simply have to be produced. Because if we continue to think in linear idea of recovery, we also risk feeding nostalgic imaginaries trapped in a supposedly lost past, which romanticizes the indigenous under colonial stereotypes of good savages and victims of modernity. The fact that these ecosystems could be produced also problematized the neo-Malthusian thesis that links overpopulation with environmental degradation. We actually sustain that more herders equal more bofedal, and obviously there are certain limits. Now, then this naturalization of this ecosystem or the naturalization of this ecosystem erases the agency of those who produce them, herders. Then they, the herders, are the ones who develop unlimited creativity, as seen also in this photo, which show a family trying to produce a bofedal where there has never been one through the use of industrial technology that does not fit the stereotypes of traditional indigenous herders. Now, while climate change and mining activities are the main threats to these ecosystems, this approach to recovery and conservation points out how science and institutions could be a major problem when they ignore herders' practices. Usually, they present these ecosystems as natural peatlands, a pre-given scenario used by humans and impacted by humans. Some authors, for example, have argued that rainfall variability played a key role in the collapse suffered by the Aymara people in the semi-arid Andean region, minimizing social factors. We have an opposite hypothesis. People migrated from the highlands due to other reasons, mainly geopolitical and related with proletarization processes and racist practices against herders. And these migration processes transform the ecology and even the climate of the highlands. Worse situation could happen when state institutions ignore the socio-hydrological ontology of these ecosystems. One of the most paradigmatic cases was the military dictatorship, the Pinochet dictatorship, privatized water in the area during the beginning of the 80s, And the state only granted rights to those who effectively used water. In this context, in some cases, wetland irrigation was ignored as a water use. The military presented these peatlands as natural. Consequently, no water rights were granted to the people who irrigated them. As a herder told me, quote, "The state said us that the wetland had its own water. but that's not true. They lied to us. They told us that it was a kind of natural thing, that's why they didn't give my dad water rights. He insisted, but they say no, and the wetland dried up, unquote. And all this surplus water was distributed to extractive industries, mainly mining. And this is how the wetland look like today. Now, some management practices are also persecuted, such as, for example, fire management. Government agencies prohibit fires because they destroy peatlands that the state wants to protect and recover. So the great paradox here is that the state bans and ignore the fact that these ecosystems are produced. So herders are producing this nature that the state want to conserve. Now, the invisibilization and prohibitions are part of authentic environmental racist practices, where herding is ordered as inefficient or even harmful. Some experts have said that irrigating peatlands is an anarchic practice. Moreover, as part of the state policy of imposing a Chilean identity on indigenous people after the War of the Pacific against Peru and Bolivia, everything related to these practices is presented as primitive and non-modern. As a urban Aymara, son of a herder, told me, quote, "In school, they told us that in Chile were no indigenous people, that we were only Chilean. The things that the herders do are things of an ancient Indians. They didn't let us speak Aymara. I feel dirty. For many years, I didn't want to go to my village. I didn't want to take care of the animals either." Now, all these representation are accompanied by process of proletarialization that have led to the depopulation of the highlands. And of course, this whole idea invite us to problematize this concept of recovery and conservation as fixed in a kind as the recovery of conservation of ecosystem that exists in a pre-given past, where also we need to consider more than technical things, especially political contexts, like, for example, racism and political economy of extractive industry. I think that now I have said enough, and it's time to move to the next presentation. Thank you.
Excellent, Manuel. That was great, and really beautiful pictures as well.
Thank you.
We don't have more presentations, but we do have questions for our panelists. Judith, maybe if you could share a first question for one of our panelists.
Yes, thank you so much to all of our speakers for fascinating reflections. And thank you also to those attendees who have started to ask questions. Please do keep them coming. We will start with a question by Diana to Laila, our first presenter. Diana says, "Thank you for your presentation, which was very thought-provoking." And Diana would like to know more about the characteristics defining the people re-identifying as indigenous. Could you speak a bit more about that, please, Laila?
Those indigenous populations have re-identified themselves as indigenous through a process of getting back their lands and also their culture. And what taking back their culture means is really diverse, depending on the people, the area, and so on. But some common key features are related to perform again the rituals that they understand are connected to their people. For instance, the Oricuri, which is a ritual that can only be performed by indigenous populations, Cariri Chocó, and cannot be seen by people that they call flat-headed. That is, they are not initiated in the mystery of the Oricuri. those rituals are really important in the process of getting back their culture, but also processes of taking back their languages. So there has been many processes in many communities of rediscovering old Jesuit books where their languages were still written, so they could reconnect to those languages and reinvent them through their day-to-day lives today, which is really interesting because I think it connects to some of the points made by Manuel just now, because it's not getting back to a past, but it's a dual process of living modernity through desilencing their culture that could not be performed. It's really important to notice that during that period that these indigenous people were so-called extinct, those rituals were actually straightforwardly forbidden by the Brazilian state. So they could not perform these rituals. I think I might have answered the question, but thanks, Diana. Really thought-provoking as well.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Laila. We do have a question for Manuel by George. George asks, Manuel, do you know whether any bofedales have been impacted by lithium extraction in Chile, given the significant amount of water required for mining in the salares? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Well, bofedales are a type of high Andean wetlands. Say, and salares or salt flats are also types of high Andean wetlands. They are different ecosystems, but both are wetlands. Lithium extraction has impacted salt flats, mainly the Salar de Uyuni and the Atacama salt flat, and at the same time the Salar de Olaroz in Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia. The impacts are clear and are quite massive. Now, more recently, due to this kind of brine mining boom, mining companies has explored the exploitation of lithium in higher basins where salt flats are accompanied, or where in salt flats are peatlands vegetation formation. So there is a kind of mixture between salt flats and bofedales, and that bofedales are clearly at risk by this kind of brine mining boom. Now, one important thing to consider about lithium is that lithium is not lithium mining. Lithium is water mining, because basically what you do when you want to extract lithium is you pump salt water or pump brines in order to evaporate them and extract lithium from that process. And in these salt flats that are full of brine, what the companies does is extract this water, and when they extract this water, they completely modify the ecosystem. And this is important to consider because brine mining is not only lithium mining. There are many other products that are obtained, like potash and also boro. And here in the region, there is a huge boro mining, who is exploding a place called Salar de Surire, where they are completely destroy all the bofedal related to this salt flat. But it's a clear threat to all of the high Andean wetlands, not only bofedales. So that's the take-home message.
Thank you so much, Manuel. We've got a few questions here that I think we're going to open up to all three of our speakers. But first, I'd like to hear from Santiago as well, and give Santiago an opportunity, maybe also to reflect on the other two presentations, if you would like to. I was fascinated, Santiago, by the diversity of different knowledges that you spoke about very well, campesinos, or peasant knowledges, non-human knowledges that contribute to the making of these landscapes. But I also thought you spoke very convincingly about how important it is to challenge this human nature separation of thinking of the environment and environmental issues as separate from humans. And I was wondering, from your great projects working across history and different types of knowledges, are there any methodological advances that can help us get closer to answers, or at least ask better questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Judith, for that question. I think that I don't know if it is a kind of innovation, but the important thing that we made at the project was to combine this anthropological way of thinking and also the historical and the archive work. And I think that was very helpful, because the main problem in our country, and also in a lot of the different scientific practice that we share with colleagues in Colombia, is that when you said páramo, everybody is saying something that is also saying something that science has shown us in a very particular way. So as ecosystem, as high-end anthropical ecosystem. So in the project, the most difficult thing to do was to learn to think páramo not only as an ecosystem, and to open up the possibilities to páramo for being another things. So in the presentation, I talk about this campesino that told us that páramo is autonomy, and the possibilities to think páramo as autonomy in a context where the definition of páramo is made only by science is very difficult. And in that way, the important thing, I think, in terms of methodology, is to develop a different kind of dialogue, not only with the communities, but also between different science, and between natural science and also social science, for allowing these other possibilities of making páramo and thinking about páramo possible, and for that reason, allowing the possibility of a dialogue that is a dialogue, not only saying to the campesinos, the marking, like the field that the campesinos need to respect and need to move inside the demarcation. That is the situation today with the problem of law and the problem of legislation about páramos in Colombia, that science have made that very specific field, and campesinos and communities have to be inside that field, and their definitions or their affects about páramo cannot be exactly marked by that marking of the field, if I am clear. So thank you for the question.
Great, thank you, Santiago. We have a question by Purin, which I think is addressed to Manuel, because it speaks about bofedales, but I do think it's a question that might relate to the issues that Laila and Santiago are researching as well, because it's a question about payment for ecosystem services.
Yeah.
So Purin's question is, what is your view on the prospect for payment for ecosystem services schemes for enhancing both conservation and social justice in the bofedales? So I'll first ask the question to Manuel, but then Santiago and Laila, if you want to add something to that, or if it does relate to any issues in your research or work, feel free to come in as well.
Well, thank you for that really interesting question. You know, I believe that this notion of payment for ecosystem services is part of the broader discourse of commodification of nature. And I think that this idea can produce several contradictions that we need to explore. However, I believe that there are certain potentials here, because if we recognize that herders have a role in conservation that must be, and restoration that must be considered, maybe I think that it would be interesting to explore models of payments to herders for their service, because if they are working, if they are investing their labor in restoring or in recovering or in producing these ecosystems that provide services to all of the world, I think it's fair to pay them. Otherwise, from a very classical Marxist point of view, can be a kind of exploitation of their own labor. So I think that we should think about it. We need to consider that payment for ecosystem services can produce a lot of contradictions. However, I think that there is some potential for payments to an unpaid labor that can reproduce also dynamics of exploitation. Maybe instead of investing a lot of money in national parks, let's pay salary to the herders.
Yes. I just wanted to add to Manuel's. I agree completely that there are contradictions that we should look at. And also, by looking at the specific case of Brazil and the indigenous populations in the Northeast, there is also a pragmatic problem, because payment for environmental services normally are related to well-established regimes of land property. You need to own the land to get access to all of those policies. And in cases such as the indigenous populations are occupying lands, this is not really a great framing in pragmatic terms, not to mention the contradictions that Manuel just pointed out. So I just put in the chat another idea of some previous colleagues of mine and Judith, Dr. Bram Buscher and Robert Fletcher, that are addressing this issue through the idea of conservation basic income as an idea that could encompass new forms of payment to people engaged in conservation areas.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have an answer for this, but I have a preoccupation that I think that I share with Manuel with Laila, and it's related with the capitalization of life. I think that if it's true that nature is not something that is separate of society, of culture, as we have said in different ways in the last presentations, I think that we need to think carefully what kind of nature we are going to make in this very capitalized way. When capital and with all these strategies to increase the way in which capital transform nature, and I think that I am very afraid of the green economies and these kind of solutions. I have a lot of preoccupation for that, because there is always a lot of possible non-planified problems that can be emerge for that situations, and this is one of that solutions that also capitalize life in ways that we need to study in the future with more with a more strong way.
Great, thank you so much to Manuel, Laila, and Santiago for your answers. We have another question from Valeria to all speakers. Is recovery in Latin America mainly associated with indigenous identities and subjectivities and their ways of life? Or can non-indigenous communities also contribute to recovery? So anybody who would like to come in on that, please do.
I can go first just because my answer will be really brief. So I think the answer is yes, of course, other communities, the idea was just to reflect on how the indigenous populations in the Northeast are doing it, but there are many other initiatives in the same sense. There is, for instance, a coalition movement between the indigenous peoples of the Northeast with the Quilombola and the peasant communities, which is called the Three Stones. And the Three Stones work with recovery and conservation as well, and they are trying to work with diversity to recognize networks that could enhance their capability of managing their own territories and therefore enhancing prosperity for their nature culture. Yeah, for sure.
I can say something very briefly. I don't think so. I think that it's necessary to abandon the centrality of the indigenous and also the idea of recovery or conservation only of rural territories. I think that we need to go beyond that. Because the relationship between nature and society and the co-production between nature and society goes far beyond indigenous people and included other groups of subalterns and even non-subalterns like peasants, women, and so on. And also, I insist, transcend the idea of rural. I think we are, and if nature is an hybrid, we also need to explore this idea of recovery and conservation of non-natural, non-rural environments like urban environments. Why not? So that's my main idea.
Yeah, I totally agree with Manuel. Thank you. I like to think recovery as building an ecology of practices. Some of them even some of the practice even identified by science as problematic, for instance. So I think that is a problem of the design of new ways of living and dying. Maybe thinking with a Haraway way of thought. So I think that we need to think more in terms of practices, of diversity of practices that can be even contrary, but can make, I don't know, a dialogue and some working together, even if this is not for a long time, or even if this is also plain of difficulties in the practice. So I agree that we need to move on of this culture schema that we have about conservation and with indigenous people. Also thinking in the very, very difficult relationship with science that this have this relation, as Laila showed us. And also I was thinking in this article of Mario Blaser about how the scientists work very well with indigenous people, as long as indigenous people make the things that scientists wanted that they make. So we need to move of this kind of structure, so to open up new possibilities for recovery.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. We have another question that goes to that might speak to all presentations and research, which is a question posed by Hannah, who asks, well, says, first of all, thanks for all your interesting talks. And then posed, in Europe and the US, rewilding is becoming a very influential concept within conservation. So how prominent is it in Latin America, and how is it perceived by local communities? If any of you would like to speak to that, just mentioning that we have only a couple of minutes left. So just if you want to speak to it very, very briefly.
Not prominent at all in Brazil.
That's
Here,
very clear and short.
yeah, here they have been a couple of very interesting works by Argentina team, specifically on bofedales. I am more than happy to share that work. If somebody is interested in it, I can send it. And well, briefly, I would say that there are a lot of potentialities, but at the same time, tensions, specifically when this idea is moved by certain NGOs or state officials who wants to conserve or to recover territories through kind of green imaginaries that can end in land grabbing.
Great, thanks. That sounds. If you can share any links, we can
Sure.
share them maybe in the chat.
So I will do it right now.
Great. I don't know, Santiago, if you wanted to add something to that.
No, I think that this is not a very important concept in this moment in conservation in Colombia, but that could change in the future. And also, I am thinking that with Manuel, we talk about the problems of thinking these kind of problems in a very linear way. And I think that Rewild could be a very, very linear way of thinking about recovery, and in that sense can be very dangerous, especially for communities not so wild or not so, I don't know, not quickly thought as wild, or I don't know, but I think that that could be very problematic, and is a way of thinking the problem from a very nature versus society way of thought.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. I'm quite fascinated by the themes that keep cropping up across all three of your presentations about the problems with linearity, with sort of binary thinking, human nature. But unfortunately, we are now slowly nearing the end of today's webinar. Thank you so much to our speakers for great insight, and to all of our attendees for fascinating questions. There's one question from Piran to Manuel about how the socio-ecological system of bofedales will look in a generation that we did not get to, but maybe Manuel, you can address this in your closing statement, if possible. And we hopefully will now have just a brief closing round where we give again the floor to each of our three speakers, Laila, Santiago, and then to Manuel. There was one question that actually Hannah and myself had that also we didn't get to ask, just because we had so many wonderful questions from our attendees about the political climates in each of our each of your contexts, and the new governments that have come in or are coming in. So if you've got any reflections on that, it would be wonderful to hear them in this final round, where we'd invite you to sum up, to give us your take-home message, any reflections on each other's presentations and audience questions. So Laila, first of all, to you, what has resonated with you? What key message would you like all of us to take away?
Thank you so much, Judith. So I'm going to try to reflect on the key messages that also resonate with what Santiago and Manuel brought to the table. I believe that one key takeaway is that our work as researchers in the social sciences, in the process of dismantling this sole legitimacy of science in conservation and restoration, to recognize how these other forms of knowledges are also really important in that direction, and to think about more democratic policies in that sense. So I think in this sense, it's really important to recognize on-the-ground practices that are being developed by peasant, indigenous women in urban, rural environments, to see how people in different types of subjugation are trying to deal with this subjugation also through environmental justice lenses, and enhance those practices, right? Instead of trying to develop ideas of our own heads. So this is something that I believe it's quite important, and also that the landscapes are changing environments, so is culture, and so those processes occur at the same time and in a really intertwined way. So it's really interesting to look at indigenous populations of the northeast of Brazil, in my perspective, because their practice dismantle completely this bon sauvage idea that Manuel brought to the table, that they are peoples of the forest living inside the forest that should be protected with the forest, with their own ancestral ways, of old ways of doing things, because they're just taking land back from capital and rediversifying themselves and the landscape at the same time. So this is a really great example for us to think about other forms of rediversifying our own landscapes as well. At least they have inspired me in this sense. So we can think about how we can think about better policies also to encompass these rediversifying processes and not rewilding. Rediversifying sounds way better in my perspective. And as for the political climate, yeah, we just got Lula elected from 4 years of Bolsonaro government. I don't believe I will be able to address that in 2 minutes, because yeah, just to say that all of us almost died of a heart attack last Sunday because Bolsonaro almost won. So this is really dangerous, because this extreme denialist right wing is still here, really present, although Lula won the elections. And on the other hand, the transition process gives us hope that this new government will be more sensitive to environmental justice, because previous governments from the Working Party were not that sensitive. They were more an old left perspective on redistribution of income, but not necessarily that sensitive to environmental justice. But they say that they're going to build a ministry for climate change and for the original people. Let's see what happens. Like, yeah, scenes from the next chapters. It's really unstable over here.
Thank you so much, Leila. And sorry, yes, I asked many questions for just not a lot of time, but thank you so much. And I agree with you, rediversifying sounds really good to me. Over to you, Santiago, for your closing words.
Thank you very much, Judith. I think that related with Páramo, the political and climate now in the country is very interesting, because the communities have begun in a couple of years have begun to transform the law, using the law in order to increase their participation in the decisions. So this is a process that is going on in this moment in different páramos of the country, and it's very interesting for us in order to see, especially for me and for our team. It's especially important to see the possibilities of that participation and the possibilities of having a real conversation with science from these different kind of knowledge. And related with the more general political climate in Colombia, this is we just changed our president, and I think that it is very soon now to see changes. I don't know what are going to happen. I am a little worried because in different institutions I feel that a green ecology wave is emerging, but and I think that it is not a problem per se, but it's a problem when you begin to think that the only solution for nature is the green economy. And I don't know, I'm not sure if the actual government can change that wave. So that is my answer.
Thank you so much, Santiago. And I mean, your presentation also highlighted, I think, really well some of the dangers inherent in relying too much on a green economy ideology as the panacea and solve all for the future. Thank you. And now over to Manuel for your closing words. And if you can also answer the final question from Piran about the socio-ecological system of the bofedales and what they will look like in a generation, that would be wonderful. Thank you, Manuel.
Yeah, thank you so much. So in relation to that question, I am not a fortune teller, and I hope that one day we expect to create certain models. But it's clear that if the management of these peatlands are abandoned, bofedales will disappear. And we have noticed that they can disappear or they are degraded in a very short term. Now, in relation to climate change, the changes in climate, of course, are drivers of bofedal degradation because they react very quickly. They are very sensitive to climate change. They are kind of sentinels of climate change. Now, paradoxically, however, they can also increase in a short time. This is very paradoxical, and since more temperature implies the melting of glaciers, which allow the flow of water for a certain limited time. Also, when there is less water in the flows, the flows become slower, which allow the formation of peat. Now, we have called these peatlands opportunistic peatlands because they take advantage of these changes. However, this greening or this increasing has short-term effects. Now, finally, in relation to this, I would like to point out that there are many cases where communities react to climate change and develop new forms of management that allows them to sustain and even increase the bofedales despite the impact of climate change. And of course, politically, this led to intensify the models of autonomy in environmental conservation. Now, the take-home message of my presentation is that we really need to pay attention to the ontology of what we want to recover. And in the case of bofedales, they are vital for sustaining herders, but also herders are particularly important for maintaining or producing bofedales. So, in other words, without bofedales, there is no herding, but without herding, there is not bofedales too. Now, if bofedales, they are this kind of as much as the product of human agency as they are of natural processes, then we cannot rely on explanations grounded in social science or natural science alone. As seen, bofedales are these socio-hydrological ecosystems, a product of hydrology, ecology, and climate, entangled with herding practices. but also histories of colonialism, racism, extractivism, and political economy. So it's urgent to articulate a transdisciplinary research for harmonizing critical attention to social relation with knowledge of the biophysical condition that sustain bofedales and also these different ways of knowing, and challenge how people think about recovery and conservation by pushing models of exclusion towards collaborative, right-based approaches that support and promote community-led conservation and customary use and destabilize racist imaginaries. Because this ecosystem, as I told you previously, they are perfect sentinels of socio-ecological transformation that push us to deploy conceptual, methodological, and political creativity to articulate diverse way of knowing to support better assessment, monitoring, and decision-making for recovering relations of people-peat co-production for ensuring environmental justice. And also, in relation to the last question about politics, it's important to highlight that Chile has just lost a great opportunity to have an ecological, feminist, and indigenous constitution. And the right wing has won or regained an important space in the current political debate. And this invites us to a very commonplace challenge for us, that we must be aware and charged, and we must be in charge of reflect seriously of what is our role as researchers in this failure, and the need to take seriously our role as organic intellectuals for this social ecological change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manuel. And I think your key themes and your take-home messages of the interdependence and co-production of these spaces between human and non-human nature, the importance of different ways of knowing and them being acknowledged in interdisciplinary and indeed transdisciplinary research, I think resonates very strongly across all three contexts that we heard about today. So thank you so much again to our wonderful speakers, Dr. Laila Tomas Sandroni, Dr. Santiago Martinez Medina, and Professor Manuel Prieto Montt. Thank you also to Dr. Hanne Cottin for taking the lead on organizing this webinar, to Lydia Harris, Elizabeth Blansell, and Leanne Spencer for all the work behind the scenes. Thanks to Despina Livierato and ISRF for co-hosting this webinar. And last but not least, thanks very much to all of you for coming, for asking great questions, and also for sharing very positive reactions of clapping hands in response to our speakers. Much appreciated. And please do come back for more IGDC and ISRF events in future. Thank you and all the best.